So after establishing in Chapter 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics the basic teleological principle that all activity aims at some good, in Chapters 2 and 3 Aristotle then moves on to establish the science of what he calls the human good and to describe the very nature of that science. Before he does this though, he offers at the beginning of Chapter 2 an argument to support the claim that there is in fact a chief good, an end to which we pursue all other goods, and he uses an argument from infinite regress, which is as follows. You can follow in the text the standard form. First premise is that if there was no ultimate end or supreme good, then we would all desire one thing for the sake of another, a process that would go on for infinity, one thing for the sake of another over and over again. Now, under this process, our desires, we can't justify them. They would be empty, vain, and futile. And it's implied within this chapter that our desires are in fact not empty and vain. In fact, they have purpose, as he claims, under his teleological view. Therefore, there must be one ultimate end, a chief good to sort of end this infinite regress, this chain of desires to which all aim is directed. He doesn't establish it now. Now, an example of the infinite regress could be the following. If we ask for what purpose we eat healthy food, we could come up with answers such as survival or physical health, and we might pursue the latter for the sake of looking good, for example, which could then be for the sake of attracting people, which is then for the sake of romance, and so on. But when does it end? Surely there must be some final good we are pursuing through this chain of goods. And he's going to get to that in a couple of chapters. But he argues that if we can know this, we're in a good position. He uses the analogy of an archer who can hit a target. We're able to get things right and hit the mark in terms of the decisions we make, in terms of living well in our life. And this is a very common sense claim. And after he makes this, he says if we know how to hit our target, if we are to know, then we need to know which science or capacity the human good is in fact the object of. And this links back to Chapter 1, where all intrinsic goods are linked with an art, science or capacity and can therefore be known and studied. Now, for Aristotle, the science of the human good is politics. And this is because politics is a master art, what he calls a master art, in that all other arts and capacities are subordinate to it and participate in it. So if we can think of the typical Greek examples, rhetoric, economics, law, medicine, military strategy, they are all subordinate to politics in that politics encompasses all of its goods, because politics aims at the general welfare of the state and its citizens. It outlines what we ought to do and ought not to do. Thus, it seems to encompass all other activities and their goods. And thus it follows that its final end, the final end of politics, must encompass all other ends. And so Aristotle concludes that the science of the human good is politics. And this again reflects the overall Greek view whereby the welfare of the individuals is linked to the welfare of the state. And we see this in Plato in his analogy between a healthy body, soul, and state, the harmony argument in the Gorgias. In Chapter 3, Aristotle then moves on to discuss the nature of the science of politics. As not all sciences, arts, and capacities are of a similar nature. The first line of the chapter is important here. As Aristotle states, our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions. Now, this is because ethics is a messy subject. Unlike something like mathematics, there is what he calls variety and fluctuation, so we could not expect the same degree of precision in our answers. And instead, he says in the text, we should be ready to speak of truths roughly and in outline in relation to political science. This again reflects his common sense view of ethics. Now, while he believes an answer can be found, it is not always going to be as precise as we want, or always the case, as the subject matter, noble and just actions, have variety and fluctuation, so the subject matter simply does not allow it. So after concluding that ethics is a messy subject, in the final part of Chapter 3, Aristotle moves on to describe the ideal student of political science. And you can see his bias towards reason. It's quite apparent here. Basically, those without the correct disposition are not really suited to study political science. And what he means when he identifies the correct disposition, he goes into much more detail later in the Nicomachean Ethics. But those who are young or youthful in character, and particularly those who are disposed to follow their passions. For them, Aristotle claims knowledge will bring no profit if they do not desire to know the good or act in accordance with reason. And on this note, he concludes the introductory chapters and moves on to the important question of what is in fact the human good.